Hey, I'm Felissa Rose, and you're watching Keto Krime.
Hey everyone, welcome to Thought Crime and Keto Krime. Today I've got the one that I've literally been putting off for months. The one that after researching it, I went down a hole so dark and so black that I never thought I would be able to get out of it. And I really had to be in the right frame of mind to speak of it. I'm still not in the right frame of mind, but I'm just going to get her done because that's what I do. I'm going to be talking about the Canadian Indigenous Schools. And yeah, that's what we're going in today. First of all, I want to put a disclaimer. So I'm going to have to use some terms that I wouldn't normally use. Indian, because that is the nomenclature of some of the things I'm going to be talking about, so I will have to use the word Indian. I know, just like I think everybody knows, that Christopher Columbus, when he named the Native Americans or the indigenous people of North America Indians, it was because he thought he was in India. He made a mistake. And that name just sort of stuck for centuries. So I will have to use that word, but know that I'm actually talking about Native Americans, Native Canadians, Indigenous people, however you want to refer to them. I will try to remember to use that nomenclature. I'm also going to be talking about colonialism, imperialism, however you want to call it, but I have to phrase it in a way that you kind of see my stance on it. Let me tell you about myself. I am English, Scottish, two tribes of Native American, based on my mom and my dad's family, and I am African. My cousin took our family tree on my father's side back as early as the 1600s in England and Scotland. So I know all about my history going back that far on my father's side, the Barclays. And my family owned a farm in Alabama that had slaves. And from that institution came the lineage of my particular family, in that one of those female slaves was my great 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 grandmother. Do I feel empathy for her state of being? I don't know what the particulars were of that relationship, whether it was consensual or not. I hope it was consensual. But the children of that union did take the Barclay surname in the late 1800s. So, and I know that's nothing unusual. Lots of freed slaves took the surnames of their former owners once emancipation happened. But, and then you trace my family all the way into me growing up in a trailer park. So, what am I saying with that? I hope it was consensual, and if it wasn't, my heart goes out to my great 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 grandmother for anything that she had to suffer. There were several children proven to be union, so she had brothers and sisters. So I don't know if it was consensual or not. I'm just throwing that out there. I'm a mutt. All of this directly involves me. And why am I telling you the story? I'm telling you the story because the things I'm going to talk about today are incredibly dark and an embarrassment to anybody that was a part of it. I will say that up front. But why am I telling you the story? of my ancestor because I'm grateful to be here. Whatever circumstances led to my birth and me being birthed in what I still think is the freest and best country in the world, and me just being alive in general, I'm grateful for that because I love life. I love being able to communicate with other people, to talk to other people, to talk to you about history. And history isn't always light and dandy. There was a lot of imperialism involved in the settlement of North America. And we can take that even further and say the western part of the United States. A lot of imperialism. It started with the Vikings. The Vikings conquered most of Europe. They conquered part of North America way back when. We know that. We know Leif Erikson had a whole lot to do with that. We know that there was a lot of conquering then. We know the Romans conquered a great deal of the world. There was conquering and atrocities then. And I guarantee you, if you study the history of these indigenous tribes, you will see that they were not the first ones there either, that they conquered other tribes. We know that the Aztecs and the Incas did human sacrifice. What happened to the Mayans? Were they the victims of a larger tribe? We don't know, but I can guarantee you that before them, there was someone else that fell to them, if that makes sense. That's what I'm saying. The history of our world is the strong conquering the weak. Do I think that's wrong? Yes. But it is our history. And unless we go back and unravel thousands of years of human history and send everybody back to their ancestral homes, I don't want to go back to Europe. I don't want to go to Africa. I've never been there. That's not my home. My home is right here. And unless you want to unravel all of that, the most we can do for the people that we've hurt is to acknowledge that we hurt them and try to make sure it never happens again. That's what I'm saying. The atrocities I read about while researching this made me physically sick, and I hope it never happens again. But if you look at, human history just in the 20th century, Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust, it happened there. We interred thousands of Japanese Americans during World War II that we're still paying retributions to. Germany is still paying retributions to survivors of the Holocaust. And I think there are ways we can make lives easier for the people that we've hurt. I weep for the people that have been trodden upon. But I also know the only way to heal is to move forward and to make sure these things never happen again. And that is the part of this video that it took me the longest to work up the courage to say, because I have an African ancestor, former slave. I have, on my mom's side, I have Cherokee Indian, Cherokee Native American. I told you I would slip up. I'm sorry. And on my father's side, I have Apache. And if you've ever heard the story of Geronimo, you know what a terrible time that the Apaches had. But I'm here as a result of some intermixing somewhere. All the way back to my Scottish ancestors, and of course a truck is going to pick this time to move in. Sorry. My Scottish ancestors mixing with my English ancestors, and the English were a bunch of sumbitches to the Scottish. So what I'm saying is that if it wasn't for every single one of those things, I wouldn't be here. A lot of us wouldn't be here. And we can make things right as best we can by saying, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that these things happened. But they did, and I think it's just in us all, in all civilization, to conquer the weak, and that's wrong. And maybe moving forward, we can do better. So that's what I'm saying. But those of you that want us to go back and unravel thousands of years of history, it can't happen. It can't happen, and it won't happen. All we can do is acknowledge the evils of the past and make sure they don't become the evils of the future. There's still slavery in the world. Africa, if you study the history of Africa, the Zulus conquered a lot of tribes in a very nasty way. And if you look at other tribes, you'll see the same thing. They sold a lot of their brother and sisters into slavery. In the Middle East, you see the slave trade still goes on in the Middle East. And it's a different type of slavery. I think we all know what I'm referring to. but there are still people being prosecuted. There are Muslims in concentration re-education camps in China, and we need to stop that. There are what I'm saying is I want us to focus on ending all the atrocities that are still going on and moving forward rather than trying to unravel thousands of years of history and advancement for the sins of the past. And they were sins, absolutely. But there are still people in trouble right now in our day and age that we need to help. And that's where I stand on that. And so with that being said, let's dive into the Canadian Indigenous schools. So, we all know the story of Columbus, but let's skip way ahead in the future from Columbus and talk about the actual, what I call, founding of the New World. It all started with the conquistadors of Spain that came here and found the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru. And they did terrible things to these indigenous tribes and eventually sent all that gold and that booty back over to Spain and established territories here. Then you had the Spanish Armada falling to the English Navy during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, and England taking over as the mainstay of colonialism, conquering much of the Caribbean and, of course, here in North America as well. The dates may be a little bit varied there, but that's the evolution, Spain to England. But you also had France, little old France, who threw themselves, not that I think France is literally literal, but threw their hat in Wales. So basically, in the 16, 17, 1800s, where the majority of what we're going to talk about took place, you had English and French here in the Americas, and mainly the Frenchmen were traders, while the English were here for a number of reasons, mainly mercantilism and, yes, religious freedom. A lot of the first English colonies were the result of trying to get out from under the state-controlled religion in England. So you had a lot of different reasons why people were here. And along with them came an Enlightenment idea known as the noble savage. And this was basically philosophers mingled with Christians that they really believed that the indigenous people of this continent, or the Native Canadians and Native Americans, were savages, but they were noble savages in that they had built a civilization of their own, and they saw them as a means to an end. They saw them as trade partners. They saw that they could advance their own civilization by becoming trade partners and, catching them up into the everyday hustle and bustle of capitalism and mercantilism. But they also saw them as an adversary to be dealt with. But before that, they saw them as an ally to conquer their rivals. So you had the French looking at them as allies against the British, and the British as allies against the French. And in 1756, this all culminated in a 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, which basically started when the French and the English fought over the New World, Canada all the way down to the United States, and they each allied with specific tribes of indigenous people that fought along with them. You had certain tribes on the side of the French, and you had certain tribes on the side of the British. And that was the first time that there was an alliance of these indigenous peoples and their colonial conquerors en masse. And this kind of became the prevailing name of the day, even though technically, I guess you could say the British won the French and Indian War because they ended up with the majority of North America except for French Quebec. They won it, and therefore the tribes that helped them won it. And this kind of idea kind of went along all through the American fight for independence. There were Native American tribes that assisted the Continental Congress and the Army against the British. and all the way up to the Plains Wars, all the way to Custer's Last Stand and the Little Bighorn, you had still had certain tribes that aligned themselves with the Europeans or the Americans and fought against their enemies, even if their enemies were also indigenous peoples. Now, the Plains War and the Little Bighorn was more of a concentrated war between certain Plains tribes, such as where I come from, the Apaches, as well as other tribes. So you had this concentrated war, even though some Native American tribes still sided with the Americans to fight against their own brothers, I suppose you should say. Now, this Plains Wars, as it was known in the United States, was known as the First Nations War in Canada. And so it was kind of the reckoning where all these tribes had fought either with the British or the French or the Americans for a specific purpose. Now those purposes were done, and now it was all, what do we do with them? And this was kind of the what we do with them. We start moving them out. It goes from the Trail of Tears, where the Cherokees, Chickasaws, and Choctaws were moved out of their native lands into a reservation. And it ends with Custer's Last Stand and the Little Bighorn, where finally the Sioux and the Cheyenne, and later on the Apache and the Comanche, finally surrendered years later and relegated themselves to reservations as well. And even though this reservation system was supposed to be the way to integrate these indigenous tribes into Western society, it didn't quite work out that way. There was still a lot of swindling, a lot of massacres, a lot of things that really did wipe out indigenous populations. And this, we get to the start of what we know as the Indigenous Peoples Reservation Residential School System. Basically, this was a push, basically started in the late 1800s in Canada and in certain parts of the northern United States that bordered Canada, to basically assimilate indigenous peoples into their culture. And they felt that it wasn't good enough to put these children in a public school system. They felt it was more in a public day school system where they would be indoctrinated into Western culture to assimilate them to the country during the day, and then be sent home to their tribes on their reservations at night to be re-indoctrinated back into indigenous culture. They wanted a complete immersion for these children, and so the residential school system was the product of that. And they decided that it should be mandatory in the provinces and the states that use these schools for these Native American children to be brought there. And what do I mean by mandatory? I mean it was mandatory. If you did not willingly send your school-age child to these schools, if you were a indigenous peoples, the military or some other authority figure would come and take your children and take them to these indigenous schools, where your contact with them was completely limited. So, state-sanctioned kidnapping. I attribute it to what happened with the Jewish people in the ghettos in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in Germany. They were forcibly moved there. Their rights were taken, and basically, even though the purpose there was extinction and the purpose here was assimilation, I think they had a whole lot in common. The schools were in mass operation for over 100 years, and in Canada it is rumored that over 150,000 children were placed in the residential schools nationally. And by the 1930s, 30% of Indigenous children were believed to be attending these residential schools. It is estimated that the number of deaths as a result of children at these Indigenous schools from a variety of different things were 3,200, anywhere from 3,000 to 30,000. Those are the stats because no one knows. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. But basically, the history had its start with the passage of the Indian Act in 1876 under Canadian Prime Minister Alexander Mackenzie by the name of John A. Macdonald, who was looking at what the United States was doing with their residential schools in the states that bordered Canada, and he decided to model the Canadian system after a broken system that was not working anyway. And he basically facilitated an amendment to the Indian Act in 1894 that basically made all First Nations tribes compulsory that they attend, that children, school-aged children, attend these schools. And that is where the Great Reaping came in, and they started basically forcing the children into these schools. Now, these schools ranged all over Canada. A lot of them were on the west coast in British Columbia. There was some in Alberta, a few in Saskatchewan, and there were some others peppered, but those were the major, the western side, middle to western side of Canada, where most of these schools operated. And they were operated by and large with a partnership with the Roman Catholic Church, because they wanted also to make sure that they eradicated the indigenous religions, which I don't know about Canada's stance on religious freedom, but here in the United States, that seems very contradictory to me about our stance on religious freedom. If they want to keep their culture and their religion, I think they should be able to, and just live among us with that religion. That would have been my stance on it, but I don't make the rules, evidently. Now, we have to talk about the Roman Catholic Church and its history of child abuse. I mean, no disrespect to anybody out there that is Catholic that follows my channel, but your church and a lot of churches have a bad history with that. So the same kind of things you hear happening in the news today were happening in mass at these schools, and it gave these predators open access to children. And as a result, you had a lot of abuse, a lot of runaways. It is said that because of the way that a lot of these children were indoctrinated, it caused the rise in suicide and alcohol rates among Indigenous peoples. I'm sure that was tied to it. But also you have to remember that the fact that a lot of these children were in very close quarters. They lived and they ate, they went to school together. And this was, by and large, during the time that before vaccines, or during the time that vaccines were first being developed, that disease was rampant. So you had, not only did you have potential abuse and murder at the hands of those in the school, you also had a greater propensity to suffer outbreaks of different diseases, which led to more deaths than should have been. Now, the Indigenous Residential Program was ended 20th century, and formal apologies were not issued by the Canadian government until the 1980s and early 1990s. And many of these schools actually didn't even close until the 70s, 80s, 90s. So the fact we got any sort of apology at all was a great thing, I think. In fact, Prime Minister Stephen Harper offered the first public apology on behalf of the government of Canada in 2008. So you had the people that ran these schools starting to apologize, and then finally you had the Canadian government apologizing. And the Truth and Reconciliation Committees were established to do a deep dive on what happened at these schools, and they gathered about 7,000 different statements from residential school survivors about the horrendous conditions that a lot of them lived in. And then you fast forward to 2021, where several mass graves were found by radar sonar. Now, all we can say up until this point is that yes, I am almost certain that those graves contain the bodies of people that died in the possession of these residential schools. What we don't know is what caused their deaths. It could have been abuse. It could have been murder. It could have been when you ran away, they shot you. It could have been disease caused by the close proximity of the people in these schools. We don't know. But what we do know is that they are no longer living, and they're in this grave. Now, some of them could have been deaths that the parents were aware of. Others could have been deaths that the parents were never aware of. But we do know by statements issued by the First Nations, the officials of the First Nations, that sometimes children just disappeared and they never heard from them again. So we can only assume that they were in schools and they died in these schools for whatever reason. And we will continue to follow the story because the excavation of these graves, the one in Kamloops, the one in other areas that could hold up to 1,500 bodies, that we will wait for the excavation to understand what exactly happened. Some of these bodies might actually just be, locals from the area that ended up in there too. We don't know. I'm just throwing that out there because I'm always believe in telling the truth on this channel. But I will continue to follow the story. But this, in a nutshell, is the story of the Indigenous people's residential schools. And it's a horrible story, and one that should never be repeated. Just like a lot of the other atrocities that I talked about in the earlier part of this should be repeated. I hope that we can heal and move forward and make sure that none of this happens again, and stop the atrocities that are happening right under our nose today. That'd be nice too. But with that being said, until next time, Keto Krime.